Welcome to this presentation regarding um, apostrophes. Excuse me for not being clear there for a second. Want to make sure that everything is set up correctly, so let me just take a minute and make sure that it is recording as it should. I am going to select this and we should be good to go. Wonderful. So I'm going to start talking about apostrophes. We're going to have several presentations, several different lectures on the topic of apostrophes. I'm going to try to restrict my presentations to about 20 minutes, so there's going to be a lot of separate videos to watch. A nice thing about watching videos versus being in a classroom is that you can turn me off whenever you want to. So if the phone rings or something good comes on TV or whatever, you can just pause me, note the time that you were listening to me, and resume at a time that's more convenient. Another neat feature about watching recorded lectures is that if there's a portion of the presentation that was especially interesting or was perhaps a little confusing, you can listen to it more than once and take notes, and then of course bring those questions to class or email me those questions so that we can get them resolved. So there's a lot of neat things associated with watching lectures in class. Now I'm going to break these up into about 20-minute segments, but there's no reason why you can't watch videos back to back to back if that happens to meet your scheduling needs. So let's get started. We're going to talk about apostrophes, when we use them and how we use them, why we use them, all that good stuff. So let's get started. Okay, there are three main times that we use apostrophes. The first one is to show possession in English. That's probably the single most important time that we use an apostrophe, and it's the only topic we're going to talk about or spend really any time on in part one of our apostrophes presentations. But there are two other common times that or relatively common times we use apostrophes. One is to show that a word is a contraction, and we'll talk more about that in our second series of lectures on apostrophes. And then the third is kind of a weird category. And people have differing opinions about whether this is a good category to use apostrophes for or not a good category. My philosophy in this course is to give you a very kind of generally received view on grammar, not necessarily my quirky views. I have a few quirks, as you might imagine, or perhaps you already know, but I try to present kind of the current understanding about what good grammar is. And so I'm not going to take a position on whether you ought to use apostrophes under these circumstances or not. But I will say this to you. Reason number 3, which we'll talk about in the second series of lectures, is the one area where it's kind of optional. You don't have to always use an apostrophe in this situation. And I will also say that people who do use apostrophes in this situation, or who consider this a reason for using apostrophes, sometimes stumble into a problem of using apostrophes, not just in these unusual cases, which we'll talk about, but in additional situations. So when we go through this material, if you think to yourself, you know what, I find this confusing. I'm not sure what an unusual case is that I can use an apostrophe, and what's a usual case that I'm not supposed to use an apostrophe. If you find that confusing, or if you think to yourself, I'm just not going to remember this, it's better for you to forget entirely about category number 3. 1 and 2 aren't optional. You've got to use apostrophes there. But 3 has some leeway. And so when you're going through the lectures, think to yourself and decide internally, is this going to be a time that I'm going to choose to use them in situation number 3? Or do I think it's going to be more confusing for me to kind of leave that door open? Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so this first series of lectures, we're going to talk about the topic of possession or ownership. You'll see that there's a little caveat here. We're going to talk specifically about, in addition to just generally the topic of possession ownership, we're also going to talk about the preposition its. That's going to be at the very end of this series of lectures, so we won't get to it during this first presentation, but I want you to kind of file in the back of your mind that there's going to be a resolution to this issue. Many times when people listen to this topic, they're thinking about the issue of its, and they're not quite sure how it all fits together. It really, really does fit together, and it really, really does make sense, but it may not be immediately obvious to you how it makes sense. So all information will be revealed, and I hope that it will be as clear as can be, but just kind of save that and file that away in your head. Okay, let's go forward. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of apostrophes, I want to take a pause here and talk about kind of a more global issue about grammar. There's a few different ways a person can approach grammar questions. One way is to learn all of the rules about whatever topic you're trying to learn. So for example, let me just flip back. You could just commit to memory these 3 situations and maybe put on a flashcard, maybe have some way of remembering it, and then you'd have all the rules about when to how to make a word plural and da-da-da-da-da and all the different categories. And you'd probably end up with a pretty thick rule book. And you need one. You do need a thick rule book, and that's why we have the Aspen Legal Handbook as a textbook. And also you have the resources of the internet to Google and get additional information. So I definitely don't want to underestimate the importance of having what I'm going to call a rule book. But the thing about the rule books is that if you don't understand why the rules are they are, it's really hard to remember them. And it's really hard to even remember that there's a rule in a particular area. And so while we're definitely going to talk about rules, we're going to talk about them a lot, we're also going to spend a fair amount of time talking about the why of the rules. Not just what the rule is, but why that rule works in a particular way. So the easiest way to learn a single grammar rule is just, to look up the particular rule. It's usually going to be a sentence or 2 long. Work on a few examples, and then you got the rule. You're good to go. But when you need to learn a whole system, the rules of a particular system, it's a lot easier over the long haul to learn how the system works, how the various pieces of the puzzle fit together. So in the first example, we just had one discrete issue. Maybe we could call this the blue puzzle piece. It's easy enough just to learn about the blue puzzle piece. But the reality is that this blue puzzle piece has to fit together with the red puzzle piece, and it also has to fit together with the green puzzle piece. And you know what? Grammar is more complicated than this picture shows, because there's going to be this blue puzzle piece is going to interact with this yellow puzzle piece, and there's going to be a black and an orange and a white and a brown and a turquoise and all kinds of other colors, and they're all going to be interconnected in very subtle and complicated ways. And so whenever you take one piece of the puzzle out and look at it in isolation, yeah, you can learn some things about it, and that's not a bad idea. But to really have a deep and robust and functioning understanding of the grammar is you have to have that 50,000 feet view down, looking at the grammar map, looking at all the different pieces and how they work together. And I'm going to call this a grammar paradigm. You could also call it a grammar map if that makes more sense to you. Let me remove the conversation from the area of grammar and talk about something that you and I face probably every day of our lives, and that is a roadmap. I live in the northeastern part of Frisco, and I teach on 2 campuses, the Frisco campus and the Plano campus. When I go to the Plano campus, I have a map in my head about the roads that I might take. Sometimes I go down Independence to Legacy. Sometimes I take Independence to Spring Creek. Sometimes I take Custer to Legacy. Sometimes I take Custer to Spring Creek. Sometimes I go across at McDermott or Hedgecoats. There's a variety of ways that I make my path, and sometimes it depends upon the traffic flows at that time. Where's there road construction? Are there problems with the light? Has there been an accident? Am I running late? Is there someplace I want to go in front of. Maybe I want to pick up something to eat, or I want to run by the grocery store, or some other task I want to do, and so I want to be sure that I'm at a particular location on one of those roads. There's lots of factors that help me decide which road I'm going to take. So my mental roadmap has a lot of different aspects to it. Your roadmap, even if you live next door to me, would be different than my roadmap because you have different things that might be important to you. You might prefer to go to this fast food restaurant or this grocery store, and I might prefer another. And so if you were to say, oh, well, you know that Chicken Express that is on Custer, and I might think to myself, Chicken Express, I don't know of any Chicken Express there because I don't happen to frequent that restaurant. But I do know where the Taco Bell is. And so you might be looking at me, go, Taco Bell, I don't know where that is, because it's not important to you. So the thing about my road map of Frisco and Plano, it highlights the things I'm interested in, the things that I actually use, or the things that I've used in my past. It also isn't necessarily to scale. You know, the distance from, as I'm going down Custer between Hedgecoats and McDermott, I couldn't tell you. I'd guess roughly it's a mile, but it might be a mile and a half. It might be 0.7 miles. I'm not sure. You know what? I don't need to know that distance because I know that, you know, where the intersections are and where I need to be and where I'm going to move over to get in the turn lane. So it's not necessary that I have the exact measurements. But let's say I worked for Google Maps or MapQuest or some other company that makes maps. Well, it'd be really important that I know how to measure that distance because if you're making an official map, it needs to be to scale. And so my map doesn't have to be, my mental map doesn't have to be precise. It has to meet my needs. And so therefore my mental map meets my needs, but it's not necessarily the map that you would need. That's what a paradigm is. It's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of seeing various pieces fit together. Let me give you another example. I have a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old. Neither one of them anymore believe in Santa Claus. But let's go back 4 years in the past when I had a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. They both believed in Santa Claus at that point in time. And they both had different understandings. I'd say my 6-year-old was still at the point where he just kind of didn't really question. He just, okay, Santa's coming. That's all I need to know about the matter. But my 8-year-old had a little bit more sophisticated worldview, and so she started asking questions. Well, how is it that Santa's able to travel to every house all around the world in one night? How do reindeer know how to fly? How does that work? How can Santa's sleigh carry all the presents? And so she started asking more sophisticated questions. And as she got older, when she was 9 or 10, she came to the realization, as most of us do, that guess what? There is no way that all those things could happen. There is no sleigh big enough to carry all the presents. There is no means of travel that would allow Santa to get to everybody's house in one night. So all of those questions, she ultimately realized, you know what? There is no way that they can all work out, so I'm going to have to put aside my belief in Santa Claus. But you can see over time, even when she was holding on to that paradigm, the Santa Claus paradigm, it was becoming a more sophisticated model until all of the contradictions finally caused the model to collapse. And so that's one of the things about paradigms, that they adjust over time as you get more information. As I travel more frequently to Spring Creek, I'm going to find there's more detail to my map. And so that's how grammar paradigms work. We all have a grammar paradigm. We all have multiple grammar paradigms. And so it's something that I'm not going to instruct you to have because you already have it. You're already fluent in English. Now, your grammar paradigm may not be identical. In fact, it probably isn't identical to mine, and that's okay. Let me talk a little bit about a related concept to grammar paradigms. Many people have the idea that there is a right grammar, that there is one perfect or superior grammar, and that all the other grammars are inferior to that grammar. And that if a person doesn't follow this grammar mode, they're wrong, they're dumb, they're poorly educated. I don't agree with that. That is not my paradigm of how grammar works. So I happen to think that everybody's grammar, every system of English grammar, is an interesting and sophisticated and complex and culturally important artifact. I happen to think that they're all awesome and amazing, even when they disagree over significant parts. And so I am not somebody who's going to sit back here and say, oh, that's ugly or oh, that's wrong. Not at all. I will tell you this, though. For this class, there is a right answer. There isn't in the world at large a right answer to these questions, but there is for this class. So if you happen to have a grammar paradigm that's different than the one I'm going to present, well, yeah, you're going to lose points in this class. Because that's not the way that we're going to evaluate grammar. But when I take off a point, when you end a sentence with a preposition, for example, I'm not saying that that's a bad system. I'm saying it's not the system that we're using in this class. So you may think, well, how do I decide? How does the instructor decide which system to use? The system that I am using is what we call Standard American English. And for the most part, most grammarians have an understanding about what that is. There are a few areas where reasonable people can differ, but the vast majority of the area, the vast majority of the topics we'll be talking about, pretty much people agree about. And this is the style of grammar that legal professionals use. It's a style that attorneys expect when they receive letters from other attorneys, expect to read. It's what judges expect to see. It's what sophisticated clients expect to see. It's not that the other styles of grammar are bad or inferior. It's that it won't get you the job. Having another style of grammar will not be the style of grammar that's going to make you successful. So my goal here is not to make you change your grammar style. It's to make you a successful, employable, well-respected legal professional. And that's going to involve you following the standard American English rules. Now, sometimes people say, quite reasonably, well, I have one style of speaking that is different than your standard American English rules. And I'd like to keep my standard way of speaking when I'm with my friends or family. Perfectly understandable, perfectly reasonable. Many of us, including myself, have different styles of speaking to different groups of people. My family comes from a small Texas town, and when I go back to that town, my husband will always tell me that I speak significantly differently. I have a more pronounced Southern accent, I speak slower, and I have more colloquial expressions in my manner of speaking. When I speak to a young child, I speak differently than when I speak to another legal professional. So there are differences in the way that I speak depending upon my audience. And you're going to have those differences too. Your differences may be more dramatic than mine. I once remember hearing a comedian talk about the fact that he had different styles of speaking, and he almost considered himself, I think he said, trilingual, because even though there were all varieties of English, when he was with his friends, he spoke a certain way. When he was with his parents or grandparents, he spoke a second way. And when he was at school, he spoke a third way. And he really was able to separate them. And so when he was in this context, he spoke this way, this context another way. That's a very valid way of communicating with folks, and if that works for you, that's wonderful. And my goal here is not to change the way you talk with your friends or anything along those lines. I will, though, make this one suggestion, and that is that we're going to be, for most of the students in this class, and perhaps for all the students in this class, there will be some fairly significant things that are going to be different about the standard grammar that we're going to be talking about. There are going to be things that you'll need to change. And whenever you're making a change in habits, and most of the people in this class will be at least 20, so when you change something that you've been doing for 20 years, it's kind of hard. It's a pretty well-entrenched habit. And so if you, while you're trying to learn the new habit, continue using the old habit, it can make it more challenging for you. Now, that's your decision to make, obviously, but keep that in mind. While I'm learning this new skill, do I want to continue practicing the old skill, or am I making it more challenging for myself than it perhaps ought to be? One more caveat I'd like to say, and that is that the things I'll be talking about primarily in this class have to do with written English. Many of the rules that we'll talk about when we talk about standard American English, we're really talking about standard American written English, because there will be all kinds of rules that I will say, this is how we do it in written English, and then 20 seconds later you'll hear me break those rules when I speak, because for the most part we don't speak standard American English that we would write. There's going to be several areas where we differ, and that's okay. In fact, there's certain times I will say it's a good idea for you not to follow the written English rules when you're speaking. But there are ways that would probably be a good idea for you to consider adopting. Some of these written rules will probably make sense to incorporate into your spoken English. So you may want to think about those also as potential opportunities. I'm not going to be testing on your spoken English. That won't have any impact whatsoever on your performance in this class. But when you go to job interviews, when you interview clients, when you talk with opposing counsel, the way that you present yourself orally can impact how successful you're going to be in your career. So it's something worthy of some reflection. Okay, so let me go back to our grammar paradigm topic. The main thing I wanted to talk about when we were talking about paradigms is I want to talk about the fact that this is a system, and it's a complicated system. And when you throw one thing out of a system, it's going to affect other parts of the system. So we have to figure out how the whole machine works so that when we make a change, we're going to make a change for the better. Okay. So we'll be using both systems. We'll be using the system where we talk about a discrete issue, like apostrophes, but we'll also be thinking about how the larger system works with respect to apostrophes. You'll find that at first it'll be a little bit confusing because I'm going to be throwing around some grammar terms and giving you some vocabulary that perhaps you haven't heard in a while or maybe never have heard before. And so it's going to feel like we're going a little bit in slow motion at first because there's going to be some catch up we need to do. But I think in the long term, it's going to be easier for you to remember it because instead of just knowing the rule, you'll know the why behind the rule. About 5 or 6 years ago, I went through kind of a grammar teaching situation, and I learned the reasons for some of the grammar rules that I had learned back when I was in middle school and high school. And no one had told me. No one had ever told me why I was supposed to do it this way. I had done it that way because they told me to do it that way. But as soon as I knew, it was like a light bulb went off. I suddenly like, oh, okay, that makes perfect sense. It sure would have been nice if somebody had told me the reason behind the rule. It's quite empowering to know the reason, number one. And number two, it also makes it a lot easier to remember the rule. And so I'll be trying to give you that information as much as possible. Our system of grammar is, for the most part, quite logical. But it's not always the only logical way of doing it. As I say, we all have a system of grammar, and really all the systems of grammar have an inherent logic to them. So it's not that you can stick it into a computer and the computer is going to spit out the perfect English grammar. There's choices that might at times appear to be somewhat arbitrary because many times there's some reasons to do it way A and some reasons to do it way B, and obviously you have to choose one way or the other, and so reasonable minds can differ about which one is the most logical. But once you know the reasons for the choice, boy, it sure can be easier to follow that rule. Okay, so now we're going to get started with some of the mechanics of grammar. We're going to first of all talk about the topic of case. When I use the term case, I'm talking about a case from a grammatical standpoint. Lots of European languages, and I don't know any non-European languages, so this may be true in other languages as well, but with respect to European languages, I can say many of them have cases. They are case-based languages. What I mean is that the form of the noun, or perhaps the noun marker in front of the noun, changes depending upon the role that the noun has in a sentence. Now, if you've spoken some of these languages, you may think, well, of course, duh. Or if you haven't had exposure to these languages, you might be thoroughly confused right now. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what you need to know for the purposes of getting through this topic. So hold your breath for a second as we go forward and talk about what does it mean for a language to have case. Latin is probably the language that has the most complex series of cases. So if you ever took Latin, you're going to immediately know what I'm talking about. When we have a Latin noun, you can tell based upon the suffix at the end of the noun whether it's the subject of the sentence. If it's the subject of the sentence, it's going to be a nominative case. Or if the word is in the possessive sense, is being used to indicate possession, it's going to be in the genitive case, which is a second in ending different than the nominative case. If the noun acts as an indirect object in the sentence, it's going to be in the dative case. If it acts as a direct object in the sentence, it's going to be in the accusative case. If it's the object of a preposition, it's going to be in the ablative case. And so each one of these has a different ending. There's some of these endings that repeat, but you can tell if you are a reader of Latin simply by seeing the end of the word, the function that the word has in that sentence. Here's a little bit of information about German. German also is a case-based language. So if you've studied German, this is going to be very familiar. So if a word is in the nominative case, like the word apple, you can see that we say der Apple, but when it's in a different sense, we might say den Apple, des Apple, dem Apple. And you can see it changes. And in fact, in the genitive case, you can see in the masculine form that they add an S. That is full up, and also in the neuter case, you'll see there's an S added. File that away for a second because we'll be seeing that S later on in a different place. But you can see how, excuse me, the noun marker, in this case the word the, it can also be the word a or an, changes, and that tells the reader, the German reader, what function the word apple has. Is the apple the actor in the sentence, or is the noun the one who's receiving the action? Is noun the possessor of something? Those are all things that we can see by looking at the noun marker and sometimes the noun itself. So we've talked about how both Latin and German are case-based languages. In fact, English's history, I apologize, is that it is also a case-based language. In other words, when I say Old English, I'm talking about the way English was spoken over 1,000 years ago. If you were to hear someone speak Old English, we wouldn't be able to really understand anything. It's the English of Beowulf. And we can see here that the ends of the words also change. So if we're in the nominative case and we're saying horse, we're going to add a UR. We're going to add an I if it's in the dative case. We're going to add a S if it's in the genitive case. So just by seeing the word, we know the function of the word horse in that particular sentence. Now, in addition to case as being a mechanism for figuring out the function of a word in a sentence, there's another tool that European languages use, and that is word order. English and French and Spanish focus on word order to identify the function that a word has in a sentence. English does not exclusively rely upon word order, though. Let's look at a Latin sentence. We've already established that Latin is a case-based language. As a result, word order has very little significance in Latin. This is an example. This is a sentence written in English. Romulus had founded the city. Of course, in this case, the city means Rome. Romulus is our subject. Had founded is our verb. And the direct object is the city. Here is the same sentence in Latin. We can see Romulus is in that first position. Condiderat is the verb. The verb has that perfect tense already included in the word. The Latin doesn't use two words to create the perfect tenses. And then we have urbum here. Now, Latin does not use noun markers, so the word there's no way of showing that in Latin. But you can see here, all of these other sentences mean exactly the same thing in Latin. So you can put the subject at the beginning of the sentence, in the middle of the sentence, or at the end of the sentence. You can put the direct object at the end of the sentence, the middle of the sentence, or the beginning of the sentence. Similarly with the verb, end, beginning, or middle. That would, of course, not work with English, but it does work with Latin because, again, Latin is a case-based language. So, you may be thinking to yourself, this is all lovely and interesting to learn about, but what does it have to do with learning modern standard American English? Well, it does have something to do with it because despite what our first instinct might be, is modern English is also a case-based language. Now, I'll be honest with you, we in English primarily depend upon word order to establish meaning. But we also do use case to a limited degree with nouns and to a significant degree with pronouns. I think one of the reasons that this can be confusing for us is that while we have case, it's not as pervasive as it is with German or with Latin. And so we don't use it all the time, and therefore it's hard for us sometimes to remember when to use it and when not to use it. So let's look for a second at some of these issues. Here is modern English broken down into 4 cases. The nominative case, we have boy and girl, boys and girls. The accusative case, we have boy and girl, boys and girls. The dative case, we have boy and girl, boys and girls. They are all identical in the nominative case, in the accusative case, and in the dative case. The only case that's different is the genitive case. In the genitive case, we add, in the singular, an apostrophe S and an apostrophe S. In the plural, we already have the S, so we add just an apostrophe. The way we pronounce boys in the nominative case is exactly the same way we pronounced boys in the accusative case and boys in the dative case. It's actually the same way we pronounce boys in the genitive case as well. We don't change the pronunciation because of the apostrophe. We write the apostrophe, but none of us hears the apostrophe or makes any change in the way we say the word because it has an apostrophe in it. So from spoken English, this is really the only box that changes the way we actually say the words. So this is our only section where spoken English is different based upon case. Remember we said before about how German, let me go back here for a second, adds an S in the masculine and the neuter case to the genitive? Well, let's look here. That's exactly what we do in English. And of course, English and German, modern German, have a very close grammatical tie to each other. So that is kind of where that comes from, a similar ancestor. Okay, so let's look at what the cases are. We have nominative case, which is the subject of the sentence. We have the genitive case, which is the possessive format. Genitive and possessive from a grammatical standpoint mean the same thing. Then I've lumped the accusative and dative cases together. You could also include the ablative case here if you want to, but we're just going to focus on these two. If it's a direct object, it's the accusative case. If it's an object preposition, it's accusative. If it's an indirect object, it's dative. You don't need to know any of this stuff. You just need to know really the genitive case and the possessive noun. Because again, the form of nouns don't change based upon whether it's accusative or dative. Okay, let's pause here and talk about the word possessive. That word is kind of confusing because we all have a meaning associated with possessive that does not necessarily track with the way it's meant in a grammatical standpoint. When we say a word is in the possessive case or in the genitive case, we mean a lot. We have a much broader category than when we ordinarily say, I possess something. For example, I have a son. He's 10 years old. I might call him my son. I don't own him. I don't possess him right now. He's not in the room with me. And yet he is my son. And so, or if I say Professor Groover's son, Professor Groover is in the possessive case, even though I don't possess or own my son. If my son were here, his name is Adam, he would say, I have a mother. He would say, my mother is Professor Groover. Or he might say, Adam's mother is Professor Groover. He doesn't own me. He doesn't possess me. And yet he would say, my or Adam's mother. He would use the possessive form of those words. So many times we use the possessive to talk about ownership or possession, but also to talk about relationship that one has. Another example is a color. My son's favorite color is green. So he'll say, my favorite color, Adam's favorite color is green. He doesn't own or possess green, but it is something that he has a relationship with. Okay, we are going to end the presentation here, and we'll resume this in our second lecture. If you have any questions or something that you'd like to spend a little bit more time on, you may want to review this first lecture again. Thanks for your attention, and I'll see you soon.